Chapter 16. The shady wireless store had taken longer than he'd planned. Since his phone and number were from Kansas, it had taken them over an hour to get it sorted out. He'd barely made it back to the ranch with enough time to eat, much less convince Madison to join him. The whole day had been a colossal failure. He pulled into his spot at the end of the row of pickups and slammed his door. He had 15 minutes before Mrs. Alice would put everything away, and he really didn't want to drive all the way back to Shady to eat unless Madison was with him. Then it would be worth the drive. He approached the little cabin and took a deep breath. He'd have to face 3 guard dogs as soon as he knocked, but seeing her was worth the trouble. She was worth it. He knocked slowly and waited. Nothing. Her friend had said she'd buried herself in her blankets and wouldn't come out, but maybe they'd managed to pry her away from her haven? She might, even now, be in the dining room eating. He turned to leave when a sudden squeak stopped him. It hadn't been a floorboard nor his boots. He waited, but nothing came from behind the door. He slowly stepped off the stairs and waited by the corner of the little house. They were newly insulated, but the walls were still fairly thin. The thing that kept them warm in the winter was small square footage, a hearty stove, and many people in the small space. There it was again, a little squeak, then a sniffle. He rushed back to the door but didn't knock. "Madison, I know you're in there. Come out or let me in, please." "Go away, I don't want to see you right now," came her quiet voice from the other side. "I won't. I'll be so loud I'll make a spectacle. Your choice." That would draw her out. She didn't like people knowing her business or watching her. His own need for privacy didn't matter at all compared to Madison. There was a rustling, then a scraping, and finally the door swung open. Madison stood before him in the little white tank and jeans she'd had on when he'd gotten her that morning. But now her hair was a mess, like she'd just gotten out of bed and her eyes were red with tears. "Come here," he whispered, his heart aching from just seeing her like that. "Go ride a horse." She narrowed her eyes at him and reached for the door to slam it. He stuck his boot in the way. She tipped her head to the floor. "I already tried. You shut me out. Now I've let go and you decide to yank me around? Just go." "What do you mean you tried? You ran away." So had he, but she didn't know he'd been gone out on Maverick all day. "I tried to find you." He took a step further into the room and she backed away, stopping only when she hit a bed set against the wall. "I wasn't here. I couldn't stay." He needed to touch her, to hold her, to make the day and Madison right again. Her breaths were heavy and eyes still shiny. "So far away you couldn't answer a text? You've been right here all week. Whenever I even turned around, you were right there, but just when I decided to reach out, you'd disappear? Or was it that you just didn't want to hear me?" "Would I be here now if I had?" She wasn't making sense, but he'd learned that women who were hurting often didn't, not to men. "I don't know why you're here. Christian charity?" She practically spat the words at him. He strode over to her and grabbed her hand, pulling her along to the kitchenette. He plopped down in one of the 2 chairs and tugged her down on his lap. She squirmed to get free, but he gently wrapped his arms around her waist. He gave her a moment, then rested his head against her shoulder and waited for her to calm. "There, now, can we talk for just a minute? I didn't get any messages because I left my phone behind when I went riding. When I got back, I busted it. It wasn't because I saw your messages and was angry. It was just a stupid move, see?" He released her back for a moment as he dug in his pocket and pulled out his phone, then handed it to her. "You can look. No numbers, nothing. I'm sorry I didn't get your message. I would have gladly come and talked to you. I thought you didn't want to see me anymore." He returned to leaning against her and waited. She had to make the next step. If she didn't accept his apology, he'd have to let her walk away. But then he remembered one more thing. "I'm also sorry about what I said earlier. I didn't think through my words first, nor was it something I felt pushed to talk about. I should have kept my mouth shut. I wanted my faith to lead you into a chosen relationship with Christ, not shove you away from it. I'm sorry I hurt you." She sighed, then shuddered. He sat up and drew her close, and she wrapped her arms around him, just as he'd prayed she would. Her tears wet his shoulder, but he didn't care. Madison fit perfectly on his lap, curled in his arms. The Lord only knew how he was going to manage this miracle. Randall would help her, and they would take it slow. They had to, living in two places. "I got word today, right before I left for my ride, that I got a grant for my horse ranch. It'll change the whole direction of it, but it'll be a good thing. I've got a nephew who was born with clubfoot. Sometimes they can fix the problem with surgery, but oftentimes they are handicapped in other ways as well." His nephew was 4 years old, but developmentally was about 2. Randall wanted to find a way to help him. "I got the grant because I want to start a program where these kids can come and have a riding experience just for them." Madison drew back and cupped his cheeks. The tenderness in her eyes almost undid him. He fought against the urge to pull her close again. That had to wait. "I talked to my mother today. We hadn't spoken in months. We talked a lot, and I'll be visiting Kansas, probably in September. Would it be okay if I came to visit you?" "I'd like that very much," he managed past the lump in his throat. She lowered her lips to his for a brief kiss. "You'll wait for me?" "I'll be right here when you're ready." Madison took a deep breath. "Randall, you have to know, there's more to keep us apart than just faith. My life, it isn't quiet. I am a librarian, I didn't lie, but—" Her voice stalled and she tucked her chin. He wouldn't have her shut him out again. He drew her face back up to his and brushed his lips over hers. "I already know. Your blonde roommate told me. You're an author. I think we can handle it." If they were meant to be together, the Lord would find a way. But her beautiful blue eyes crinkled in worry. "Nope, we aren't going to worry about this. Right now, we are only going to think about us." He clutched her close for a minute, then lifted her off his lap. "Let's go get something to eat. I'm guessing there were no snacks under that quilt." Madison laughed nervously. "No, I wasn't hungry." He held out his hand for her, and for the second time that day, led her toward his truck. Madison scrounged for her brush hidden deep within her purse and combed the knots from her long hair as Randall drove. He didn't say much, but he didn't have to. The silence held no questions, which was all right, because she had no answers. He was here. That was all that mattered. Her quick trip through the book of Romans reminded her of many of the things she'd learned as a child, and had just accepted as truth then, when life was simpler. Danica had been right. There was a deciding factor in her decision to avoid Christians, and it actually had little to do with Christ. She had no trouble believing there was a God. It was the people she took issue with. A young man in her youth group her senior year had done everything in his power to catch the attention of her closest friend, Molly. Molly had been quiet, and this boy had asked her friend to do things for him in order to keep his attention. Things that would eventually ruin her reputation. Madison had watched what was going on and had brought the troubles to her youth leader's attention. One of the pastors had shamed Molly in front of the group, making Molly and her parents leave and never return. Nothing was ever said to the young man, at least not where anyone else could hear. The injustice had driven her from the ranks of Christian to those of the ambivalent. If salvation couldn't be lost, then she was still saved. But would she choose it again in that moment? She couldn't answer that, which probably made her answer no. There would be no lying to Randall, but if he could show her another side, open that door back up, she would listen. Her phone buzzed, and she slid the brush back in her purse and dug for her phone. A text lit up the home screen. "Been praying for you and your friend. Let me know if you need anything else. Mom." Randall glanced across to her for a moment. "Everything okay?" Even though she'd be leaving Wyoming in a little over a day, everything was exactly as it was supposed to be. "Yes, Mom is praying for us." Randall released the giant steering wheel with one hand and reached across the seat. She slid her hand across to meet his, and the warmth infused her with comfort, belonging, and strength. "Then we're in good hands." Shady wasn't big. She couldn't even remember much about it from when they'd driven through on Saturday, but it didn't look like they'd have many places to choose from for their meal. Randall parked in front of a small diner and came around to help her. There were only 8 booths, but none of them were occupied. A sturdy woman with streaks of gray in her hair and nurse's shoes met them at the table midway through the diner. Randall waited for Madison to take a seat, then he slid in next to her. She wanted to protest. She was here to look at him. He smiled at her and rested his hand briefly on her knee. Her insides did a little pirouette, and any thought of complaining flitted from her head. Though there was no one else near them, Randall lowered his voice. "Don't worry about whether this is a date or not. I'm buying, because if it wasn't for me, you'd have eaten back at the ranch." "So this isn't a date?" Why did she have to sound so desperate? He'd already said they couldn't be much more than they were. He took her hand and drew it to his lips, brushing it gently over her knuckles, before letting her go. It was so old-fashioned, yet so masculine. When his eyes lit up at the contact, she wanted more. More of him, more of everything. The waitress returned. "What can I get for you two?" Randall let her go first, then ordered for himself, and the woman left them alone. "Randall, you can't share your faith with me without the desire for me to accept it. It would be like a car salesman talking to me about his favorite car on the lot and not trying to sell it to me. It just doesn't work that way. So I want to know, why? You aren't like my parents. I barely remembered you were a Christian until we butted heads about it." His glance fell to the table and he clasped his hands together. "I want to be stronger in my faith. I'm trying. It's hard to be the one to stand out. I tend to be more of a shower than a proclaimer. I believe because I've seen too much in my life not to. Haven't you ever gone through something so amazing that you knew it couldn't be coincidence that you were there?" "Not yet. But is it possible to feel like you're about to walk into that kind of situation?" The longer she was with Randall, the more it felt like their meeting had been arranged in the stars. He'd only been in Wyoming for 1 month and would be leaving soon, and someone else had scheduled her to be there. She never would have chosen to come to Dawson Creek Ranch all on her own. "Yes, I definitely do. Keep your eyes open and watch what he does. It's going to be amazing." His eyes twinkled at her. The old questions that always hit her when faced with faith weren't quite so insistent, or maybe she just wasn't willing to listen. "I can't wait to see what he has in store."